So our next presenter is Fred Bergman, and Fred is with the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council. And Mr. Bergman joined APEC in June 2009 after working as a Director of Economics and Stats Division with the Nova Scotia Department of Finance. During his 18-year tenure at the Department of Finance, he was involved in the analysis of the impact on the HST leading up to harmonization in Nova Scotia in 1997, and he worked as a senior tax policy analyst up until 2004. Since joining APEC, he has provided presentations on the economic outlook and commentary and analysis on economic and fiscal policy. Fred has a Master of Arts in Economics, Master of Business Administration, and is a certified management accountant. I'd like to welcome Fred.
Thank you, John, for inviting me here to speak to you about the HST. I worked so long at the HST with the Nova Scotia government, 13 years as a senior tax policy analyst and tax policy analyst, that I became known as Mr. HST. So I was glad to move on to APEC to try something new. So I'm going to talk to you a bit tonight. Let's just see if I can get this to work for me. I'm going to talk to you a bit tonight about a few things that I've looked at over the years on the HST, and John maybe kind of revisit the approach that we used back in the mid-1990s. We had the opportunity to look at the HST for about 3 years. We actually began negotiating with the federal government in 1994, and we signed an agreement in October 1996, and April 1st, 1997, the HST was implemented in Nova Scotia. So we had a long, hard look at this. And of course, until it was the right deal for Nova Scotia, we didn't sign on the bottom line. Now, Newfoundland and Labrador and New Brunswick as well harmonized at the same time. I think none of those three provinces have any regrets about harmonization, and it's been a strong competitive advantage for those three particular Atlantic provinces. And as we know, in the last couple of years, Ontario now and British Columbia have also harmonized their sales tax July 1st, 2010, although BC is going to rescind its harmonization April 1st of next year. Quebec's had an equivalent of a harmonized sales tax for many years. So tonight I'm going to talk a bit about the economic and fiscal impact of the HST and its benefits. I'm going to talk to you a bit about how the current PST applies to the agricultural sector, because originally when I was invited to come speak here a couple months ago, I decided to focus on the agriculture sector in particular, but I know the audience is broader than that now. I'm going to talk a bit about how the HST will apply to the agricultural sector, so you can see the differences and the nuances, where there'll be increased costs, increased benefits, that type of thing. As well, I'm going to talk a bit about how the HST applies to food products and food processing in particular. Because there's a bit of overlap there as well with the agricultural sector, so I thought that was applicable. And finally, I'm going to draw some conclusions. Now, you have to bear with me if my voice gives out a couple of times. I've just recently come down with a cold, and lo and behold, I have to present tonight. In terms of the, I think just to kind of lay the foundation, I just want to talk about the general size of the agricultural sector and PEI and its economic impact. The PEI Department of Finance released a report within the last year. It was last year's budget, not this year's budget. When I look closely at some of the information they put out in their budget backgrounders, they released an estimate that said the agriculture sector represents about 15% of GDP in PEI. Now, I presume that would include the food processing, so it's a fairly significant sector, obviously, to the island economy. Agriculture and food processing accounts for about 43% of PEI's exports. Now, this is excluding seafood processing. If you added in seafood processing, which is basically fish, it gets it up another 20%, so closer to 63%. So just looking strictly at agricultural products and agriculture, it's closer to 43%. That's about $323 million. So it's, once again, a significant sector to the island. Farm cash receipts last year increased 17.5% to about $474.5 million, so a strong year last year. Obviously, strong potato prices in particular helped benefit the island. Directly, the sector employs about 5,000 people from what I can tell. It employs about 3,200 in the primary agriculture sector and another 1,800 plus in food processing, once again excluding seafood products, excluding fish products. So this is just direct employment, direct economic impacts. It is not the spin-offs that I'm talking about in this particular slide, just to make that clear. Agriculture had labor compensation of $143 million in 2010. That's roughly about 81 million of that was for the primary agriculture sector, and the residual, which would be a little over 60 million, almost 62 million, would have been for food processing, once again, excluding seafood products now. This is direct labor income, not the spin-offs. Earlier this year, the PEI Potato Board released a study on the economic impact of just the potato farming sector, including the food processing side of potato farming. And it estimated that about, I think it was around 12.1% of all jobs in PEI are linked to potato farming, and as well 10.8% of gross domestic product, which is what economists use to measure value added in an economy, represented as a share of total GDP for the island. So farming is obviously a significant sector to PEI. This next slide basically shows data over the last 10 years or so for farming on their operating expenses, including depreciation and wages, but excluding, I should say, yeah, and before any government rebates, some minor government rebates. And that's the green line. So the green line is basically what's happening with operating expenses for the farm sector in PEI. The red line is farm cash receipts, just direct cash receipts, excluding direct payments from government and excluding crop insurance. So it's, if farmers had to make it on their own, had no insurance, had no help from government, a worst case scenario, what would their profitability look like now? This slide is not meant to offend farmers that you're in the wrong business and you should get out of the business and you're not making money. This slide is to show you that it's very important, like any business, including farming, to keep your expenses down. At the end of the day, to try to save a bit of money. Now, the average gap over this 10-year period between this measure of expenses and this measure of cash receipts for farming is that average gap between the green line and the red line is about a little over $22 million. So that's a gap, obviously, that farmers would have to make up, if not for crop insurance, if not for subsidization or direct payments from government. Now, obviously, in 2011, very good year for farm cash receipts. This year so far is looking like it might be a good year, but the weather can play a role, and export markets and the like can play a role. But still, you can see there's a need for the farm sector to try to minimize these costs. Now, keeping in mind fuel prices for a number of sectors rose last year quite a bit. Last year, if you look at gas prices, diesel fuel prices, home heating oil prices, they all went up close to 20% on average. I looked at the numbers somewhere around 17, 18%, somewhere as high as 26% of those three fuel categories. So on average, close to 20%. Those fuel costs represent over 6% of farming's total operating expenses. So if they went up 20%, and they represent 6% of your total expenses, that means your expenses went up 1.2%, which is roughly $5 million. So you've got a $5 million gap that got created last year just because of higher fuel costs. Once again, how can we save money? How can we get rid of that $5 million, or at least put a dent in it? Well, I'll give you an answer shortly. Just going to move on to the next slide here, see if I can get this to work. All right, in terms of the economic impact of moving to an HST, as Mary well pointed out, the HST is a value-added tax. Now, she showed a great example of how businesses get input tax credits and they save because of that. And I think in her example, she showed it, two businesses in between before it got to the end consumer, say you or me. And one of those businesses, I think, paid $240 in sales tax and then got a $240 input tax credit. The second business got a $120 input tax credit because it paid $120 in sales tax. Well, under the HST, if they're either a taxable supplier or a zero-rated supplier, they'd get all that money back, both of those businesses. So now you've just taken $420 out of the taxman's pocket and put it into the business sector's pocket. As Linda gave an example, she can reinvest that. She can give her employees higher salaries. That obviously has very strong benefits for the economy. Michael Smart, who's a professor at the University of Toronto, did a study within the last few years that looked at the economic impact of HST in the 3 Atlantic provinces since harmonization, and he estimated that total business investment in non-residential construction and machinery and equipment went up by about 11% in those 3 harmonized provinces as a result of harmonization. So there's real money being put back into the hands of businesses, being put back into the economy, generating more jobs, more income, more economic wealth. Another basic advantage of harmonization is that it kind of increases economic efficiency. It's a broader-based tax, so it applies to services. Generally, PST, provincial sales taxes or retail sales taxes, apply mainly to goods and less so to services. So it's a broader-based tax, typically a lower tax rate because of that, but also there tends to be less exemptions under a harmonized sales tax or a GST than a PST. Now, some might say, well, geez, I'm not going to get an exemption. That's bad, right? Bad for you as an individual, but we economists, we look at the big picture. We don't look at just the individuals. We have to look at all the individuals. We have to look at all the businesses. We have to look at all the sectors. What's the bottom line? Well, when you have less exemptions, everybody's getting treated fair. Then there's no biased decisions made. When a business decides to invest in this sector or that sector, or an individual decides to become an entrepreneur and they try to decide, well, geez, should I invest in that sector or that sector? Well, geez, I think I'll invest in the sector with all the tax exemptions. Well, all of a sudden you got all these people going into this sector. Maybe we don't need that many businesses in that sector. All of a sudden that can be bad for wealth distribution, bad for investment distribution, bad for the economy in general. So value-added taxes, a number of countries around the world, including the European Union, Australia, and New Zealand, just as a few examples, have the equivalent of a harmonized sales tax. The United States is still old school. It still has the PST in a lot of the states within the US, but they're kind of one of the last holdouts globally of the industrialized world. And I'm not going to talk a bit about the rate because I think Mary covered that off pretty good. This is just showing you some of the numbers from 4 of the harmonized provinces, including PEI, assuming it harmonizes April 1st of next year as it's announced. And in this slide, you can see what the revenues were under the PST prior to harmonization for each of the 4 provinces, what the rates are, the harmonized rate, that's the number in red at the top. So that's what they harmonized at. The second line is the embedded tax on business inputs, which Mary talked a bit about. So we estimated at the time that Nova Scotia harmonized that about 32% of our current sales tax revenues were taxes on business inputs that were non-recoverable by businesses, i.e. the example you gave, Mary, or Linda, I should say, so eloquently about, well, we had $60,000 in building supplies. We paid 10% on that. That was $6,000 that we couldn't get back. Well, in our case, we estimated in Nova Scotia that was $240 million that businesses were paying, could not recover, almost 1/3 of the tax we collected under our version of a PST. So it was quite significant. Now, when you harmonize, you put the bulk of that back into the economy. Now, there's a portion of that you don't put back. Exempt suppliers, as Mary pointed out, are not eligible for input tax credits. So those limited number of sectors, like financial services, the landlord example she gave, those particular sectors bear some unrecoverable tax. In Nova Scotia's case, we estimated at the time of harmonization, we'd get about $59 million from exempt suppliers. So $180 million, roughly, that 240, went back into the Nova Scotia economy on the date of harmonization. In terms of compensation, that's just the estimate that each of the actual numbers for 3 of the provinces, what they actually got. Initially, the federal government offered us half of that amount. Of course, it was my job to get that amount up as high as possible. I don't know if they paid me enough. I'm not sure I got my fair share, double what we originally got offered. I think they offered us, well, actually, the very first time they offered us $100 million. Now, we trailed, the 3 Atlantic provinces blazed the trail on compensation, and everybody's following suit, and there is some benefits to government as well, but there's a reason why you get compensation. And in most cases, basically, when you first harmonize, you incur a revenue loss because harmonization, and the way that compensation's calculated is fairly complex, and in fact, it's that complex I can't fully remember all the details. They didn't compensate us for 100% of our losses. I think it was a certain amount above 5% of our losses or something like that. It's so long ago, it's hard for me to remember. But at the end of the day, depending on what you set your rate at, that drives the compensation in a very precise calculation. It is not a handout. It is not a, you sign on the dotted line and we'll give you a bunch of money. Not like that at all. It's just a straightforward calculation. It's actually based on a very good estimate of your loss from harmonization. That same loss estimate that they calculate, that's how you actually, all the money from the GST, HST goes into a big giant pot. There's a very complex formula that figures out what each province's share of the HST is because it's collected by the federal government. That same formula is used to calculate your loss as it is to calculate the revenues to each government that's harmonized with the federal government. And it was my job to kind of keep them honest on that as well for a number of years. And so you can see what PEI estimates it's going to get from the HST. Basically what I did is I took the PST revenues in the budget for this year and I added $25 million to that because the budget effectively said that they'd get another $25 million once they harmonized at a rate of 9%. The $70 million estimate, that's an estimate from APEC. That is not from the PEI Department of Finance or the PEI government. I basically took 32% of PEI's current PST revenues for 2012-2013 estimated in the budget, which is roughly 71 million. I rounded it down, I think, to 70 million. And then the HST compensation was an actual number announced by PEI. In terms of how the PST applies currently to the agriculture sector, there's a number of specific exemptions within the Revenue Tax Act and the Revenue Tax Act regulations that apply to the agriculture sector. So things like livestock, feed, fertilizer, machinery equipment, some big ticket items. Obviously the capital items, as Mary pointed out, the machinery equipment, those are big ticket items that obviously farmers would benefit greatly from having an exemption on those particular goods. There's also some general exemptions that apply across the board to all sectors. For example, fuel, a lot of fuel products, electricity, firewood, renewable energy, they're also exempt to farmers. The other things that are exempt are actually admissions to agricultural fairs and harness racing. So if I go to the Charlottetown Raceway to attend a race, I can go in there and not have to pay a fee on top of my, my harness racing ticket just to get in the door, so to speak. In terms of items that are actually taxable under the current PST for the farming sector, I did up an estimate based on looking at some data for the farming sector, something called the Canadian Farm Financial Database, which lists all the operating expenses. And I went through each line by line saying, sort of like what Linda and Mary both suggested, go through your business expenses and look line by line, see whether or not you're going to pay PST, HST or not, and what's the difference. So that's what I did. I went through and said, is that subject to PST? Is it not subject to PST? And then I placed a value on it. And I estimated that about $3.9 million in PST burden is paid by the farming sector on various things. For example, motor vehicles are taxable under the new motor vehicles are taxable under the PST. So they're going to be bearing some tax on motor vehicles. Some tools are not exempt for the agriculture sector. Some exempt tools are things like veterinarian tools or blacksmith tools. Acetylene and oxygen used in welding are exempt under the Revenue Tax Act, but other tools, like some hand tools, might not be exempt under the Act. So they're bearing some tax on hand tools, an example, on their telephone bill, on computers, on software, on office supplies, so on and so on. So they are bearing some tax. As well, there's actual tax on the betting. Pari-mutuel betting is a fancy term for tax people for horse race betting. So there's some taxation on the betting side related to the agriculture sector in terms of application of PST. In terms of the HST and how it applies, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because Mary went through this. There's basically three types of goods and services under the HST. They're either taxable, which means fully taxable. They're zero rated, which is another version of taxable, but taxable at 0%, or exempt supplies, also taxed at 0%. The first two categories, taxable and zero rated, are subject to full input tax credits. The third category, exempt supplies, have no tax on their sale, but they don't have the advantage of input tax credits. Now the reality is there's a number of sectors that actually have a mix of those, and I'll give you a perfect example. The banking sector, you go into your bank, some of the services you get are taxable, some are zero rated, and some are exempt. And once again, there's a complex way to figure out, for them when they're filing their tax return, what that mix is and how to calculate their input tax credits. Now, in some exclusive cases, there's businesses that are strictly selling exempt supplies and have no advantage of claiming input tax credits. But usually they're selling a mix of goods, and anything that's taxable or zero rated, they are getting input tax credits on. In terms of what's HST taxable for the farming sector, most energy products like motor fuel will now become taxable. Electricity will become taxable. Now, the PEI government, as Mary's already pointed out, is not going to tax home heating fuel. My guess is they'll most likely do that through what's called a point-of-sale rebate, because that's what most other harmonized provinces have done. It's the easiest way to do it without having to amend and change the Excise Tax Act for each individual province. The federal government likes to have one tax act, Excise Tax Act, for the GST and the HST for all of Canada, not nuances for each jurisdiction, because that adds extra complexity that no one needs in terms of administration or costs. Other things that are going to become taxable under the HST, veterinarian drugs and supplies will become fully taxable under the HST. Missing charges to those agricultural fairs and those harness racing events, they're going to become fully taxable under the HST. Domestic freight services, which is a fancy term for trucking within Canada as an example, will become taxable. Application services, which is where you pay somebody else to spray your farmland with a pesticide, herbicide, that'll become fully taxable. So there's a number of items that will become fully taxable, including leased machinery and equipment. Only machinery and equipment that's purchased by a farmer is zero rated, which I'll show here in the next slide. If you lease machinery and equipment as a farmer, you're actually going to start paying HST on that, as you pay GST now. In terms of what's zero rated, as I just said previously, the purchase of farm machinery and equipment, we're actually going out and buying it outright, not leasing it. That's now going to be zero rated. A number of other items that were exempt under the old PST are going to continue to pay no tax on under the HST, and so there's a long list there. A fairly similar list overall, but with some exceptions. So a lot of the basic food commodities are going to continue not to have tax applied to them, as well as livestock and some of the crops and the like. Fertilizer, pesticides, typically if they're bought in larger quantities, which farmers usually do, they're not going to have tax applied to them. And so there's going to be, continued pretty well similar treatment tax-wise overall. The international freight transportation and exports outside of Canada, that is not going to be subject to HST. Now, under the PST, if a farmer incurs tax on computers or software or some of his motor vehicles that are for road use, not for farm use in a field, if he's bearing tax there now, he may have to pass some of that tax on in terms of the prices that he sells on his goods that get exported outside of Canada. So those goods outside of Canada have embedded tax in them, and the price is probably higher than it otherwise would be because of that embedded tax. That makes that good less competitive in a global market environment. The beauty of the GST and the HST, all exports are zero rated, no embedded tax for the most part beyond any exempt supply embedded tax, which would be much less than what the amount of embedded tax there'd be under a PST, as I showed in the Nova Scotia example. In terms of what's HST exempt, well, for the most part, most of what farmers do is basically zero rated, with some exceptions. There's not a lot. Farmers typically are not exempt suppliers, but these are just some examples of things that would be subject to exempt supplier status, such that they could not get input tax credits. So you can see some harness racing examples there. Also financial services. Once again, the banks are selling some exempt supplies. The other example is I think Mary had pointed out bridge and ferry tolls. Obviously, you have a ferry that comes in PEI. Obviously, you have a big fixed link bridge. Fees related to go on the ferry or go on the fixed link basically are considered an exempt supply. In terms of HST on food processing and food sales, most basic foods and beverages, excluding carbonated beverages or alcoholic beverages, are typically exempt from the current PST and will continue to remain effectively zero rated under the HST. So they have to be basic commodities, basic food commodities, or basic fruit juices, and have a significant enough pure fruit juice content in order to be zero rated under the HST. But alcoholic beverages, carbonated beverages, prepared meals at restaurants, prepared pizza at a takeout joint, or even prepared foods at a grocery store where there's a lot of value added, they become taxable under an HST and are fully taxable. Now, for the most part, those types of prepared meals and prepared foods and alcoholic beverages and carbonated beverages, they're already subject to a PST under the current sales tax. So the tax status for the most part is not going to change. Machinery equipment used in the manufacturing process typically is not subject to PST. It's effectively exempt, but under a harmonized sales tax, it's going to be subject to tax. But once again, manufacturers and processors are usually selling taxable supplies, so they're usually going to, or in some odd cases, they're selling zero-rated supplies if they're manufacturing prescription drugs, for example. They're going to be claiming full input tax credits, so get all that tax back. Goods used to manufacture a finished good, so you have a raw commodity that goes into a finished good. Typically, those will be taxable, but once again, there's input tax credits, but there's some exceptions. If you're a food processor and you're buying raw potatoes to manufacture into French fries, those potatoes are still zero rated, so there's still no tax on the potato itself. But other commodities, like maybe you're using canola oil to make the fries or something like that, well then that, or salt, manufactured salt. Well, salt wouldn't be a good example. The canola oil might be a better example of there's enough value added that may attract tax, but once again, they'd get input tax credits anyhow. Goods for what's known as resale within the PST are typically exempt. For example, a retailer who buys a good from a wholesaler to resell it to you, the end consumer, that retailer would not pay PST typically on that particular good. But under a value-added tax, they would start paying tax on that good for resale. But once again, most of what they're selling is most likely taxable or zero-rated, so they'll be able to get input tax credits. I'm just going to wrap up some quick conclusions and try to move it along a little faster. One of the key things I wanted to point out is Mary talked about a potential cash flow issue under an HST, and that's what I've tried to estimate for the farming sector. How much working capital are they going to have tied up in paying HST? And I estimated that at about $12.5 million. Now that's monies that they should be able to get back fully under an input tax credit system, but they have to pay that tax up front when they buy that input, that business input, and then they have to get it back through the input tax credit system. Now, there's a few things they might be able to do to get around that. You have three options under the HST when you file your GST HST return. You can file monthly, quarterly, or annually. For those that are filing annually now that might have a bit more tax tied up in working capital because they're now moved from a GST world to an HST world, they might opt to file sooner. That's one option to kind of reduce that cash flow burden. Some sectors also can take advantage of some other ways to reduce the need for software or systems. There's a quick method of accounting which applies to some sectors, but it may not fully apply to sectors that sell zero-rated goods, such as the farming sector. There's also a simplified method for calculating input tax credits, which some sectors, once again, can take advantage of to kind of speed up that process to get that working capital back sooner without having to invest heavily in a lot of complicated software and IT and cash register systems to track all of that. So that's certainly a big advantage for the sector to take advantage of those rules to try to minimize that working capital impact. The other thing I just wanted to mention, go back up one, was just to reiterate what are the bottom line savings to the agricultural sector from harmonization. Well, that PST burden that I estimated that was about $3.9 million that I believe farmers paid in 2009 as a result of having to pay a tax on some goods and services that they're buying. That basically becomes a savings to them under harmonization because they'll be eligible for full input tax credits, and because they're selling mostly zero-rated goods and getting full input tax credits, they'll save almost $4 million. There may be a case where they could save over that. Within the Revenue Tax Act and Revenue Tax Act regulations, if you dig down into the bowels of the Act, normally farmers who are bona fide farmers selling $10,000 or more a year in farming goods, or 25% of their gross annual income comes from farming, are considered full-time bona fide farmers and are issued what's called a revenue taxation permit. The dreaded permit that Linda talked about, oh, you need a permit for this, you need a permit for that. It's not dreaded. I used to manage provincial sales tax as well. It's just part of a process to keep the system flowing properly. that particular permit is really only for full-time farmers, but within the regulations, there's a way part-time farmers can actually apply to a refund to the minister. And the wording in the regulations says the minister may. And when I wrote legislation and regulations, I learned many years ago that there's a big difference between may and shall. If it's a shall, the minister must. If it's a may, he may or may not. Under the HST, even if you're a small supplier and you're a part-time farmer and you opt to register and you're selling less than $30,000 a year, you get full input tax credits. It's not a may, it's a shall. And I just want to quote an article in today's paper, and I'm not going to quote the person, so I'm going to say Bergman. I'm not going to say who this person's name is, but Linda talked about educating the general public, and that's why I came. I want to educate you people today. You may disagree with me, you may not like what I have to say, but I'm going to educate you. Bergman said, and this is somebody that's in the B&B industry, bed and breakfasts, and that's the only hint I'll drop. Bergman said he will likely be put out of business because he previously didn't have to pay GST because the couple grosses less than $30,000 annually. Will they gross less than $30,000 annually? Technically, they're a small supplier. They don't have to collect the GST now. That's right, they're a small supplier. Well, guess what? The HST is the GST. The GST equals the HST. They are one and the same. It is not a new tax. It mirrors the rules. If they're not paying GST now, or if they're not collecting GST now in their sales, they don't have to under the HST either. I'd like to educate that person, if nothing else.